It didn't happen on a battlefield. It wasn't part of a major offensive, and it wasn't reported in the news. But to those who lived through it, and those who bled because of it, that moment would echo for decades. The first bullet fired by U.S. troops in Vietnam, March 1965. Just days after American boots touched Vietnamese soil, tensions ran higher than ever. The beaches had been quiet, the villagers wary, the jungle watchful. Most believed this was still a defensive mission. Marines were here to guard air bases. No orders had been given to engage the enemy unless directly attacked. But fear doesn't wait for orders, and confusion doesn't read rules of engagement. That morning, a patrol left the Da Nang perimeter on what was supposed to be a routine sweep. 5 soldiers, 1 interpreter, 1 radio, and a stretch of dirt road winding through a sleepy hamlet called Thanh Phong. What happened next would never appear in official briefings, not for weeks. Even then, the story would be twisted, downplayed, buried beneath politics and press releases. But for the people of Thanh Phong, it was the day they stopped calling the Americans guests and started calling them invaders. The Marines walked, in formation, scanning rice paddies, fields, rooftops. An old woman stepped outside her home, holding something in her hands. Maybe a tool, maybe food, maybe just her laundry. One soldier shouted. She didn't understand. The shout turned to a warning. The warning turned to panic. Then came the crack. 1 shot, 1 scream. 1 mother collapsed in the dirt. The patrol froze. Chickens scattered. Children cried. Another man, likely her son, ran forward. Another shot. By the time the dust settled, 2 villagers were dead. One was a woman. The other, a boy no older than 16. The Marines radioed it in. Hostile encounter. Suspected Viet Cong contacts neutralized. But they weren't armed. They weren't fighting. They were farming, living, breathing, until they weren't. The village held a funeral the next morning. No chanting, no flags, just tears, silence, and a vow. Never again. Among the Marines, no celebration, only a grim silence. 1 soldier threw up behind a tree. Another stared at his rifle like it had betrayed him. And somewhere in Washington, the wheels kept turning, because the war had officially begun, not with strategy, not with honor, but with a mistake, a moment of fear, a trigger pulled too fast, and a truth buried too deep. Today, few remember that patrol. Fewer remember their names. But Vietnam remembers the sound of the first bullet, the sound of everything falling apart. It was supposed to be a routine mission, a patrol through a quiet village, a show of force to remind the Viet Cong that America was here and watching. But by the end of that day, civilians were dead, homes were burned, and the illusion that America was simply defending freedom shattered with the pull of a trigger. August 26, 1965, Cam Nay, Quang Nam Province. The village of Cam Nay lay nestled in the green of Vietnam's central lowlands. It had survived decades of war, first against the French, now caught in the storm between the Viet Cong and the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese army. American commanders had received reports that Cam Nay was being used as a transit point or staging area by Viet Cong guerrillas. No hard evidence, just whispers, shadows, suspicion. That was enough. The mission, that morning, Company D, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, was sent to clear Cam Nay. They were told to expect mines, booby traps, possible ambushes. The rules of engagement were vague. If threatened, respond with force. And in Vietnam, threat was a word with blurry edges. The Marines entered the village in formation, weapons loaded, eyes scanning every hut and thicket. Helicopters hovered above. Journalists tagged along, including Morley Safer, a Canadian-American. Reporter from CBS News. His camera crew would document what happened next, and it would shock the world. The first signs of trouble. As the patrol moved in, they found no resistance. No gunfire, no VC flags, no weapons caches. Instead, they found thatched huts, old men, women, children barefoot in the dust. But then, an explosion. A Marine tripped a hidden mine. The blast injured his legs. Panic rippled through the ranks. Suddenly, every shadow became a sniper, every villager a suspect. The patrol tightened formation, tensions peaked. And then, the order came down. Burn the village. Flames and fear Marines began setting fire to the homes, using Zippo lighters, kerosene, and flamethrowers. Some villagers were pulled out first, others weren't so lucky. Huts collapsed in flames, choking the air with smoke and screams. One Marine later admitted, "I didn't know what was in those huts. I just followed orders. But I'll never forget the sounds coming from the ones we burned." Several villagers, including elderly people and children, were killed or injured. They weren't armed. They weren't resisting. They were simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Caught on camera, Morley Safer and his team filmed the entire operation. The footage showed Marines torching homes, leading crying women and children through smoke and leveling a village with military precision. That evening, CBS aired the story in the United States. Millions watched in horror. "This is what the war in Vietnam is all about," Safer said. "The destruction of the Vietnamese village so it can be saved." The fallout. The report sparked immediate backlash. In Washington, the Pentagon was furious. President Lyndon B. Johnson reportedly called CBS and screamed down the phone, "You've shat on the American flag." The military claimed it was a legitimate operation, a response to enemy activity. But the damage was done. Cam Knee was not a battlefield. It was a village, and the world had seen the truth with its own eyes. Inside the unit, some Marines defended their actions. Others questioned them. One soldier, interviewed anonymously later, said, "We were scared, man. One mine, and we lost it. But when you torch a village, you can't pretend you're just a peacekeeper anymore." Another said, "I don't know if we killed VC that day, but I know we lost something inside us." For the villagers of Cam Knee, the survivors buried their dead quietly. They rebuilt what they could. But the trauma lingered. To them, the Americans were no longer protectors or liberators. They were occupiers. And with every funeral came a new vow whispered in the shadows: "We will not be burned again." Historical significance, historians today agree. The incident at Cam Knee was the first moment the American public saw the war not as heroism, but as tragedy. It marked the beginning of doubt, division, and distrust, not just in Vietnam, but in living rooms across the United States. The bullet may not have been the first, but it was the first seen around the world, and in many ways, that report fired the first real shot of the war for American hearts and minds. His name wasn't in the headlines. There was no medal, no court-martial, just one man, one rifle, and a decision that still echoes, decades later. He was one of many. A young Marine deployed to a foreign land, trained to fight, ordered to defend a base. But on that August day in 1965 near Cam Knee, he became the first American soldier in Vietnam to shoot and kill a civilian in front of a camera. And that moment, frozen in film, became the face of a war no one was ready to understand. Private, First Class Edward Johnson, Ten Tai Joy Nung Dua Tren Nhiều Bao Cao That. Born in 1946 in a small town outside Pittsburgh, Ed Johnson grew up hearing stories of World War II. His grandfather served in the Pacific. His father had fought in Korea. He enlisted in the Marines at 18, wanting to make them proud. When he arrived in Vietnam in early August 1965, he still carried that same youthful patriotism, but also a growing anxiety. The heat was unbearable. The jungle, unfamiliar. The language, incomprehensible. The enemy, invisible. The day it happened on. August 26th, Johnson was part of the patrol sent to Cam Knee. They had been briefed quickly. There may be Viet Cong activity. Check every home, expect resistance. But when they arrived, There were no fighters, just villagers, mostly women and children. At first, Johnson held back. He didn't want to raise his rifle. But then a mine exploded. A fellow Marine screamed. Blood sprayed into the air. The scene turned from calm to chaos. Smoke. Screams. Orders barked in every direction. A woman came running from one of the huts, clutching something in her hands. Cloth, maybe a blanket. Johnson couldn't see clearly through the dust. He yelled for her to stop. She didn't. She couldn't understand. His sergeant shouted, "Take her down!" He hesitated. His finger found the trigger. Then, the shot. The aftermath. The woman collapsed instantly. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a trap. It was a bundle of clothes, a blanket wrapped around a baby. The baby survived, the mother didn't. Johnson stood frozen. He didn't reload, didn't move. He just stared. The cost of obedience back at camp, no one said. Much. The official report noted it as a necessary engagement. The interpreter said, "We told the locals to stay inside. She ran. It was her fault." But Johnson didn't sleep that night, or the next. In his notebook, he wrote, "If I'm the good guy, why do I feel like the villain?" Silence and shame in later interviews, Johnson never denied what happened. He didn't blame his training. He didn't blame the woman. He blamed the fear and the uncertainty. Everything we were taught, shoot fast, don't hesitate, it all made sense in training, but no one prepared me for her face. Years later, he returned to Vietnam, not on orders, but in search of peace. He visited Cam Ne. The village was rebuilt. He stood at the same spot where he pulled the trigger. He brought flowers, but he never found the baby. The hidden legacy Edward Johnson never made the history books, but his story echoes the experience of thousands of young Americans, trained to react, thrown into a war that didn't play by the rules they were taught. Cam Ne wasn't an anomaly. It was a beginning, a sign that the war wouldn't just be about firefights and ambushes. It would be about mistakes, misjudgments, and the moral cost of being afraid at the wrong moment. Testimony to Truth in 1982, Johnson testified at a Vietnam Veterans Roundtable in Washington, D.C. He didn't cry, he didn't shout, he just said, "I was told to defend democracy, but I killed someone who never threatened me, and I've carried that with me longer than any weapon." His voice shook, not from guilt alone, but from the weight of knowing that silence would have been easier. But silence, he said, is how wars repeat themselves. Reflection. There were thousands like Ed Johnson. Some pulled the trigger, some didn't. Some never made it home, but all were changed. The first bullet wasn't fired in heroism. It was fired in panic, and its echo, recorded, replayed, remembered, became the ghost that haunted the war from the very beginning. They called it collateral damage, a military term, sterile and cold. But in the villages of Vietnam, it had a different name: loss. Cam Ne was just the beginning. After the burning of Cam Ne on August 26, 1965, the U.S. military maintained that the village had been used by Viet Cong fighters. But international journalists who had witnessed the operation, particularly CBS reporter Morley Safer, told a different story. They described frightened civilians, crying children, and the methodical destruction of homes by U.S. Marines. When the footage aired in the U.S., it caused shockwaves. Viewers saw Marines setting fire to thatched huts, women sobbing, children clutching their mothers. Smoke rising where lives had once stood. The backlash was swift. The White House response President Lyndon B. Johnson was furious, not at the Marines, but at the media. He reportedly called CBS to accuse them of treason, claiming the network had undermined national security and made American troops look like Nazis. Behind closed doors, military officials worried, what if this war can't be controlled on television? They feared that the war's image, not its strategy, might lose them public support. But for the villagers of Cam Ne and hundreds of others like them, the issue wasn't optics, it was survival. villagers left with nothing. In the weeks following the Cam Ni raid, U.S. forces began ramping up similar operations under the doctrine of search and destroy. Villages suspected of harboring the enemy were routinely burned or evacuated, but suspicion was often based on vague intelligence or aerial surveillance. Thousands of civilians, especially in provinces like Quang Ngai, Quang Nam, and Binh Dinh, were forced from their homes. Some moved into strategic hamlets, fenced-off areas under South Vietnamese control. Others fled into the jungle. Most had nowhere to go. They became internal refugees, living in makeshift camps, depending on food rations and foreign aid. Children. Of the fire among them were children like Nguyen Thi Hoa, age 9, from a village outside Tam Khai. Her family's home was burned during a U.S. sweep operation in late 1965. Her father was mistaken for a Viet Cong supporter and detained. He never returned. Hoa and her siblings lived under a torn tarp for months, surviving on rice from Buddhist temples and scraps from U.S. base garbage piles. In an interview decades later, she recalled, "I didn't understand the war. I just knew that one day my house disappeared, and no one ever explained why." A shift in journalism Cam Ni marked a turning point in war reporting. Until then, many American journalists had relied on military briefings and official statements, but after witnessing the reality on the ground, some began to question the narrative. Photographs of burned villages appeared in Time, Life, and the New York Times. Stories of displaced families and civilian deaths began surfacing more frequently. Even respected journalists like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan began to openly criticize the U.S. mission in Vietnam. They didn't call it treason. They called it truth, psychological warfare. But the impact wasn't only physical. It was psychological. For many Vietnamese villagers, the presence of American soldiers became associated not with protection, but with destruction. Every helicopter overhead brought dread. Every footstep in the dirt, fear. Every misunderstanding, a potential death sentence. Some villagers began to side with the Viet Cong, not out of ideology, but out of anger. Others withdrew completely, refusing to cooperate with either side. A South Vietnamese official in Quang Ngai told a journalist in 1966, "Every time Americans burn a village, the communists gain 10 more fighters." The cost in numbers by the fire. End of 1966, according to estimates from the International Committee of the Red Cross and independent observers, over 125,000 South Vietnamese civilians had been killed or injured. Tens of thousands of homes had been destroyed. More than 2 million people had been displaced. Many of those deaths were not caused by direct combat, but by bombing raids, search operations, and misunderstandings. Collateral damage becomes a pattern. Cam Ni was no longer an exception. It had become a pattern. In Mai Phu, Bin Hoa, Vin Chau, and later, My Lai, similar stories emerged. Villages erased. Civilians killed. Reports suppressed. Each time officials used the same language. We were engaged. We responded. Collateral damage was unfortunate but unavoidable. But in Vietnam, there was no such thing as unfortunate. There was only the empty chair at dinner, the burnt altar, the silence where laughter used to be. Reflection, what began as one patrol, one shot, had now become a doctrine, the idea that you could win hearts and minds by fire and steel. But hearts don't respond to bullets, and minds don't rebuild overnight. They remember. They grieve. And when you burn their homes and call it strategy, you lose the very people you claim to protect. The U.S. military thought it was crushing the enemy, but every time a village was burned, a new enemy was born, not from ideology, but from ashes. A shift in the countryside. Before 1965, many South Vietnamese villagers, especially in rural provinces, tried to stay neutral. They farmed by day, prayed by night, and avoided politics. They didn't fully support the communists, but they didn't trust Saigon either. And the Americans? They were foreigners, powerful, distant, but neutrality dies when your home is on fire. After Kemny, the story repeated itself in dozens of villages, homes torched, altars destroyed, civilians killed by mistake. Villagers who had once refused to take sides now had no choice. They began to fight back. Case study, Maipu, Quangangai, late 1965. Located in a region labeled by U.S. forces as a hotbed of Viet Cong activity, Maipu was a quiet farming village with fewer than 800 residents. On November 11, 1965, a company of U.S. troops conducted a search and destroy sweep through the village. There was no official engagement, no gunfire from the enemy, but several homes were destroyed. 2 elderly women were accidentally killed in a grenade sweep. A teenage boy was arrested and never seen again. That night, half the village left. Where did they go? Many of them joined or provided support to the National Liberation Front, NLF, also known as the Viet Cong. They didn't join out of communist belief. They joined because the people who promised to protect them had become the reason they no longer had homes, weapons. From grief, the U.S. government invested millions in psychological operations to win hearts and minds. Leaflets, loudspeakers, radios, promises of freedom. But none of it could erase what fire had written into their lives. A girl whose father was shot in an accidental raid became a courier for the NLF. A farmer whose buffalo was killed by an American. Convoy provided food and maps to guerrilla fighters. A monk whose pagoda was bombed in a misdirected airstrike gave shelter to wounded VC soldiers. Every death added another thread to the fabric of resistance. American intelligence missed the change U.S. Commanders frequently complained about the elusive enemy. They hide among the villagers. They use children to carry messages. They strike and vanish. But what many failed to realize was this. The villagers didn't just hide the enemy. They became the enemy, because when war enters your home, you don't need propaganda. You need justice. And if justice won't come from the skies, you go looking for it in the jungle. The power of memory in Vietnamese culture. Memory is sacred. Ancestors are honored daily. The past is always present. So when a family altar was destroyed, it wasn't just wood and stone lost. It was legacy. Children grew up not with bedtime stories, but with funeral chants. They remembered the day the helicopter came. They remembered the soldier who fired first. And they grew into young men and women who knew that the fight was no longer far away. It had come to their doorstep. The village that repelled a patrol in early 1966, U.S. forces attempted a return to a previously cleared village in Quang Nam, but the village had changed. Instead of fearful civilians, they were met with coordinated resistance, booby traps, ambushes, even accurate mortar fire, signs of tactical training. It wasn't the Viet Cong who had returned, it was the villagers. Trained, armed, and ready, U.S. troops retreated with casualties. Commanders were stunned, but the message was clear. Burn a home, and you build a fighter. A quote from the Field Colonel Charles Johnson in an internal military report stated, "We're losing the countryside not because they believe in Marx, but because they no longer believe in us." The human cost from 1965 to 1967, the number of South Vietnamese civilians joining or assisting the NLF increased by nearly 40%, according to captured documents and CIA field assessments. Entire hamlets disappeared overnight, not because they were destroyed, but because the people walked into the jungle and never looked back. They didn't care who won in Saigon. They only knew that the soldiers who called them friends left behind fire, death, and silence. Reflection wars are rarely lost on the battlefield alone. Sometimes they're lost in a village no one remembers, in a hut set ablaze for a threat that never existed. In the silence of a mother burying her child by candlelight, the U.S. came to Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. But with every village destroyed, it only spread faster, not because of ideology, but because when you take everything from someone, they have nothing left to lose. They called it a mission. They called it a patrol. They said it was necessary, but history remembers it differently. It was the beginning of the real war. When the first bullet was fired by U.S. troops in Vietnam, it didn't just kill a person. It shattered the illusion that America could enter a land so ancient, so deeply scarred by colonization and division, and fix it with guns and good intentions. That first shot wasn't fired in defense of democracy. It was fired in confusion, in fear, and in a country that never invited it. The real damage, the war that followed, would claim millions of lives. But the real damage started before the first battle. It started in the homes that burned, in the children who watched their parents die, in the soldiers who came back haunted, not by who they fought, but by what they became. It started with a mistake, and then another, and then hundreds more, until no one could remember how it all began, only that it couldn't be stopped. Or the Vietnamese, for the people on the ground, in places like Cam Ne Mai Phu and countless unnamed hamlets, war wasn't ideology. It was personal. It was loss. The girl who lost her brother to a stray bullet didn't care about communism. The farmer whose field was cratered by bombs didn't read the Geneva Conventions. They didn't need books or speeches to know the truth. They lived it. And for the Americans, the first bullet created more than an enemy. It created doubt. Young soldiers, barely out of high school, were forced to make life or death decisions in languages they didn't speak, on land they didn't understand, against people they were told to protect. They weren't monsters. But the system they served gave them no time to ask, "Are we doing the right thing?" Final reflection: this is how the war began, not with an invasion, but with a misunderstanding, not with a battle, but with a funeral. And once blood touched the soil, Vietnam was no longer just a place on a map. It became a memory, a scar, a lesson, a warning.